devotional study of the book of Job as we continue looking at the question of suffering. I'm Pastor Greg Bing of Grace Bible Church in Fort Worth, Texas, and glad that you're here with us today for this study from the Word of God. We've reached the end of Job's dialogue with his three friends, so I thought it would be a good time to briefly review what we've seen so far in our study of this book. The focal point of the book is a man named Job, and he has an amazing history. He is a blameless and an upright man, one who feared God and shunned evil. He was wealthy, well respected in his community, the spiritual head of a large family, 10 children. He was described in Job 1:3 as the greatest man of all people in the East. Satan came before God and accused Job, and so God allowed Satan to test Job by, number one, taking all of his possessions, all of his servants, even all of his children, all died. Then to take away his health and replace that with painful boils over his entire body, which brought about a loss of respect from both his family and his friends and his community. His wife was very discouraged and urged him, just curse God and die. But Job refused to do so. Instead, he fell to the ground and he worshiped, saying, "The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." And in all this, Job did not sin, nor did he charge God with wrong. Three friends did come to visit Job, and they found him sitting on top of an ash heap. In fact, when they first saw him, they didn't even recognize him. He'd changed so much over the last couple of months. They came and sat with him for 7 days in silence, and then and they mourned with him as he sat there. But then Job spoke, and as he spoke, he longed for death, and talked about the cruelty of what he was having to go through. And so his three friends' intention to comfort quickly turned to criticism and condemnation. We find three cycles of debate that are described that deal with this issue of why Job is suffering. The first friend, Eliphaz, spoke with the voice of experience. He reasoned with Job, saying, "Only the wicked suffer." The second friend, Bildad, spoke with the voice of tradition, and he lectured Job, saying, "The wicked always suffer." The third man, Zophar, was the voice of assumption. He simply assumed these things were true. He condemned Job, and he said the prosperity of the wicked is short-lived. They may prosper for a while, but before they die, they will get their judgment from God. All three friends held to the same moral code, talking about how God always works, teaching that God punishes the wicked with sufferings, and that's universal, that Job is suffering miserably, and that therefore Job must be wicked. Job responds to their argument with several observations. Number one, the righteous also suffer at times, and that's what he contended about himself, that he was righteous. He had done nothing deserving of this type of punishment and severe sufferings. He says some, in fact many of the wicked, do not suffer in this life at all. In fact, some wicked enjoy a full, prosperous life all the way until they die, and those were never answered. In Job chapter 32, we introduce a new speaker, a man named Elihu. And the first 6 verses of this chapter go from poetry to prose to introduce this new speaker. Look in verse 1. So these three men, Job's three friends, ceased answering Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. Now, they believed that Job simply contended that he was righteous. They believed it was a self-righteousness. And they'd reached a point where there was nothing more for them to say, and so they stopped answering Job at all. After Job's last speech, they just stopped responding at all. In verse 2, then we see this happens. Then the wrath of Elihu, the son of Barachel, the Buzite of the family of Ram, was aroused against Job. His wrath was aroused because he justified himself rather than God. Also against his three friends his wrath was aroused, because they had found no answer and yet had condemned Job. Now Elihu waited. He waited patiently while all of them spoke, but eventually when there was a lull in the conversation, the three friends didn't speak, Job had just finished speaking, his passion flared within him, it kindled, it was aroused against two people, against two different ones. Against Job, number one, it says because he justified himself rather than God, and I think that means rather than letting God justify him, he justified himself and claimed he was righteous. He also, his wrath was kindled against Job's three friends because they found no answer to Job's sufferings. They really had no answer to explain why Job was suffering, and yet they went ahead and condemned Job as being guilty with a simple assumption that he must have sinned. So it says in verse 4, because they were years older than he, Elihu had waited to speak to Job. we're not told this earlier, but evidently Elihu was there to see this whole debate and to hear this whole debate between Job and his three friends. And he waited to speak to Job, and he wanted to speak to Job. But he waited because his friends were all older than him. Job was older than the others, and not just a little older, but much older, implying that Elihu is very likely a young man. And so he had waited to speak, and verse 5 says, "But when Elihu saw that there was no answer in the mouth of these three men, his wrath was aroused." Now, there it doesn't mean, I don't think, that that they stopped speaking, but that he had listened to all this time and he heard no real answer to Job's issue, Job's question of why the sufferings had come upon him. And so he says, he speaks in verse 6, "And so Elihu, the son of Barachel the Buzite, answered and spoke. And he said, I am young in years, and you are very old. Therefore I was afraid, and I dared not declare my opinion to you. I said, age should speak, and multitude of years should teach wisdom." We see in verse 6 that the poetry resumes at this point. We're past the prose section, the poetry resumes, and Elihu answers. And primarily at this point, he's speaking to the three friends of Job. And he says, "I was afraid. I shrunk back from speaking at first because I'm very young, you're very old, and I believed age should speak out." The idea that age brings wisdom, experience brings wisdom and understanding. They said, you're the ones who should teach wisdom. But, he heard no real wisdom coming from them. And so in verse 8 he says, "There is a spirit in man, and the breath of the Almighty gives him understanding." The spirit that we have within us, that part of us, is what allows us to know and to communicate with God. And I think that's what Elihu is speaking about. He understands he's got a spirit that can know God. And he says, the breath of the Almighty gives the spirit of man understanding. And I think that he's talking primarily about himself. He's talking about that he has received wisdom from God as God has spoken to his spirit. And so now Elihu thinks differently than he did before, that age should speak first. He says in verse 9, "Great men are not always wise, nor do the aged always understand justice." "You have come to see," he said, "that great men and aged men are not always the wisest people, and they don't often understand what real justice should be, the pronouncement of judgment in sentencing to someone." Therefore, in verse 10, he says, "Therefore I say, listen to me. I also will declare my opinion." He says, now let me have my chance. Listen to me. I will declare my opinion. Now, it's not the way we usually think of the word opinion. This is really a word that speaks of knowledge. He's saying, I will declare to you what I know, what I have learned, what I've experienced. And so he says in verse 11 and 12, he says, "Indeed, I waited for your words. I listened to your reasonings while you searched out what to say. I paid close attention to you." And he says, "And surely not one of you convinced Job or answered his words." He's asking for a hearing and he says, "I waited for you. I listened to you. I paid close attention to what you said." But the conclusion was that not one of you, number one, convinced Job. The word convinced means proved or convinced or convicted. In other words, none of you was right, and none of you could prove anything to Job about what you were saying. None of you also answered Job's words. Job had brought up many arguments that they simply had no answer to or didn't even address. It's almost like they didn't even listen to or hear Job. And so in verse 13, Elihu says, I have to speak now, lest you say, we have found wisdom. We have found wisdom. I don't want you to assume that because no one is answering you anymore, that you believe you have given the right answer. He says, God's the one that's going to vanquish Job if he has sin in his life, not you. You're not his judges. And so he says now, verse 14, he says, "Now he has directed his words against me. He has not directed his words against me." Now he's talking about Job. He's saying, Job hasn't directed his words against me, so I will not answer him with your words. I'm not going to answer him like you did. I'm not going to criticize him. I'm not going to condemn him like you did because he's not answered me in the way that you have. So in verse 15 he says, Elihu, he says, "They are dismayed and answer no more." Now in verse 14 he says he. In verse 15 he says they. It appears that Elihu has now turned and he's speaking more specifically to Job in verse 15 about the three friends. When he says they're dismayed, your three friends are now broken down, they're shattered. And so they answer no more because the words escape them. They have nothing left to say. And I think they're probably shattered a little bit about the fact that Job hasn't gone along with their ideas. Job has basically contradicted what they're saying. So he says in verse 16, he says, I've waited. He says, because they did not speak, because they stood still and answered no more. I waited up until a point when they seemed to be through, be finished, and so I took the opportunity. And so he says in verse 17, I also will answer my part. I too will declare my opinion. Again, my knowledge is what he's saying. For I am full of words. The Spirit within me compels me. I think this is the Spirit that he's speaking about, that he believes has received understanding from the Almighty. He says, indeed, my belly is like wine that has no vent. It's ready to burst like new wineskins. Elihu had something to say. He believed he had the answer. It's like a young child in school when a teacher asks a question and someone knows the answer, and the child will sometimes put up their hand and say, me, I know. It's almost like Elihu saying, I know, I'm about to burst. And so he says in verse 20, I will speak that I may find relief. I must open my lips and answer. I have got to respond to this because I know what's right. He says in verse 21, let me not, I pray, show partiality to anyone, nor let me flatter any man. For I do not know how to flatter, else my Maker would soon take me away. What he's saying is I'm going to speak plainly to you. I'm not going to show partiality. I'm not going to show favoritism. I'm not going to flatter anyone with these. I'm just going to speak to you the truth. And I want you to listen to me because I think he's convinced that he has the answer to this. How do we view Elihu's contribution to this? Bible scholars vary widely in their ideas about Elihu and about whether he adds anything to this. Some believe that he's a brash young man, that he's angry, and that his arrogance is that of youth and inexperience. He talks about my opinion or my knowledge. He says, listen to me. Some people believe that there's an arrogance there in what he's saying. Some people believe that he's very wordy, but that he really adds nothing to the discussion of why Job is suffering. One commentator says it takes him 24 verses to say, look out, I'm going to speak. And his speech covers 6 chapters, so there's a lot that he certainly says. Some believe that what he says is just a meaningless interruption of the narrative and that it actually should be excluded, considering that really, you look at the text, Elihu is not mentioned before chapter 32, nor is it mentioned after chapter 37 when he ends his speech. We'll consider these questions next time. I hope that you'll join us as we continue our studies here in the book of Job.